and welcome to The Brood. My name is Letitia, and I'm here with...
Josh.
Hi, Josh.
And Chris.
Hello, Chris. So tonight
Hi.
we're going to talk about haunted spaces. And we've got three movies we'll be focusing on. First up is going to be Haunting of Hell House. Second, Tale of Two Sisters. And third, Inferno. First, I want to start with a quote, though. This is from an essay by Aaron Smuts, who I'm not sure exactly what his sort of academic specialty is, but he wrote an essay called Haunting the House from Within. And here's a quote from it. I propose that this willingness, and he's talking about the willingness to enter into a haunted house film, I propose that this willingness has to do with a fundamental aspect of our relationship with space. It is common to speak of places as charged or tense, to get feelings of dread or nostalgia from certain spots. Some haunted house films leverage this experiential characteristic to fuel the horror, and without it the subgenre would probably not exist. I thought this was kind of an interesting quote to start with because with the haunted house or the haunted dwelling or haunted space, there is this obvious common aspect of that you enter a space in order to have the experience. It's a kind of enclosed location, and that seems to be the essential thing about the haunted house film. So the one major theme that we might talk about tonight is the idea that there's a specific location where some kind of traumatic events have happened, and that there's a specific space where there's been some kind of curse or something that has caused this place to be warped or somehow wrong. Another really common theme that I found, and we might talk about this in a minute, is memory and guilt, that this is something that the space carries. So I just want to throw it out to you guys. We when we were emailing me, we made a list of sort of essential haunted house films. So I'll throw it out to you guys. Which ones did you see, and did any of these themes resonate, and were you surprised by any of the background movies before we get into our major three?
Made my way through a lot of kind of ghost story haunted house movies, as kind of working through. And I'm going to just go ahead and come out and say this right now. I think that what I've discovered is that I don't really like haunted house movies. that there's something kind of fundamentally disappointing about them. And I think I've kind of narrowed down what that is. But, I made my way through a lot. And really, for me, one of my foundation kind of horror movies is Poltergeist. From when I was 11 years old or something, which I think is pretty effective. Like so many of these movies, right up until the third act. And I think maybe we can have that conversation later on. But I think that a lot of kind of these haunted stories have trouble paying off in the end. That they're more about kind of the cinematic experience and less about plot or like that kind of climactic payoff at the end.
Yeah, I could agree with that. Definitely the both parts of it, that they are more about the cinematic experience, but they are usually in that third act. I feel like there's a difficulty because I guess something maybe about the haunted house is that it's a horror that the nature of it has to do with influence and the influence that it's having on the people that happen to, wander into this haunted house. And sometimes I think that you're denied a certain kind of explicit contact between the thing that is causing the dread and whoever our surrogate is. And that's something I've found a little, I think maybe until you brought it up I didn't realize it, but had the same kind of dissatisfaction because of that.
I might almost feel like my feelings swing kind of the other way, because there is a lot of crossover between the haunting and the possession story.
Yeah,
they kind of bleed into each other, like say an Amityville Horror kind of story. Where it's really hard to say which genre you're in there. In a way, that's more satisfying to me, because it kind of takes away the need for that recognition scene later on, or whatever, that place where the creature does become manifest, which
Yeah.
watching a lot of the current, there's lots of ghost stories out there right now, whether it's Paranormal Activity or I just watched The Innkeepers. They all, what I've noticed is that they all just kind of fall back on this kind of J horror, kind of black-eyed, gaping-mouthed thing, and that's usually, at this point we've been so saturated, it's pretty much a disappointment when that shows up, as opposed to all of the kind of eerie, atmospheric things that I think are what make ghost stories interesting.
Yeah, I would agree. I'd say that the sort of need to explain or show or somehow like break down the experience and figure out exactly what it's consisting of at the end of these movies often is a problem for me. And I thought I loved haunted house movies, actually. That's kind of why I chose it, because I thought, oh, this will be interesting. I enjoy this kind of movie, but I was a little disappointed by many, though there were some that I really loved. So
I feel like almost, my experience with like the idea of a haunted house has been more satisfying in literature rather than films. Like Peter Straub and Stephen King are very good because they just revel in the dread. Like, I think the haunted house as the symbol or the thing that is off in the distance that you're looking at is much more effective, and what I like a lot more than when things become manifest or they enter into the house. Like the place of the house in, say, like Salem's Lot is probably one of my favorite things about that. Ultimately, maybe the film becomes about something else and the book becomes about something else, but that's some of the most, dread I felt and fear I felt is just the place of the house in that film, the mythology behind it, the constant focusing on it from a distance, and I think that's more satisfying to me ultimately. That's the satisfying element of the haunted house for me personally.
It's hard to talk about a haunted house without it becoming metaphorical almost immediately, and I mean, kind of what you're describing there is kind of that entering into, which was right from Letitia's opening quote. And the first thing I thought of when Letitia was reading that quote was that, and talk about, is the idea of entering into a space for an experience, and that sounds to me like cinema. That this really is about, you go into the movie house and the lights go down and the show begins. So I think there is something just inherently, I'm not sure which is it. Is it the ghost stories are cinematic, or that the movies just crave ghost stories? I don't know.
I think maybe that's a good place to start talking about the first film, because what you're saying is, and I agree, is that going into the theater and going into the cinema and the lights go out, it is that haunted house experience. It's that entering. But when we go into the theater, we're entering the theater, but the essence, the nature of watching a film, we're entering our own mind, and I think that's a big theme in all these haunted houses movies, is like this idea of like you're entering. If the house is a body, it's inhabited by a consciousness, and so you're almost walking into somebody else's mind or your own mind. I don't know, something like that. And I think that's connected to that metaphor, or connected at least to that experience.
Well,
I would watch the movie called Being Dario Argento.
Yeah.
So you mentioned Legend of Hell House, but I was kind of curious. Did anyone see The Haunting? Was it 62, 67? I can't remember the year. It's very similar in terms of the plot. Did any of you guys review that one?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And I thought maybe before we get to Hell House, because The Haunting and the book, the Shirley Jackson book, The Haunting of Hell House, or The Haunting of Hill House, right? That's the one. It's such a classic haunted house text, and you mentioned books. And for me, that was kind of the book. That's a book that I love and that I think is beautiful and that works on so many levels and frightening, but also sort of very psychologically full. And I was kind of curious about that movie. I really wanted to see what themes were resonant, and if that one also had the sort of disappointing last act, and then we can maybe transition to The Legend of Hill House.
Yeah.
I
think.
Go ahead.
Well, I think that The Haunting, and then Legend of Hell House are maybe like the most archetypical like films of the house. The house as the site of, I think we were talking about this before, emotional trauma, and the house having its psychology and having its emotions and being these people caught up in the emotions and the consciousness of this house. And it might even be more clear in The Haunting than it is in Legend of Hell House. But yeah, I think this kind of sets the bar pretty high, both those films. And for that, and I guess strangely, I don't find I get a slight disappointment, I think, at the end of these films, because there is a resolution. It is resolved, but it's funny because it does speak to a kind of very like pragmatic and kind of science-based like view of the world, that like we can solve these problems of the supernatural, but at the same time, it's not satisfying to me, because that's not what I want from the film, really.
Yeah, that's a weird thing in haunted house movies, right? That there's often this sort of scientific attempt to come in and explain, and usually it fails or kind of half fails. But there is that weird, it's almost procedural. There's like, okay, now it's time to get the scientist with his little machine.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that the failure is pretty well by design. I mean, it's like, it's one of those, we bring in the gadgets and the smarty pants, and we bring them in and we put them in their place. Their face is going to melt off in the mirror. They're going to, they're going to run screaming, whatever. I think that there's a lot of that antagonism going on in these stories. This kind of rationalism versus just that kind of primal fear.
Yeah, the fear of this unknown place. This place that is somewhere at the end of the street or something like that. That's what I like about it. But the funny thing is, it's not solved by magic. Like you said, like this kind of, rationalism is usually it seems like there's been a rational solution in the films that we watch. There's a rational solution. It doesn't come from like a magic book or something like that. So it's like an interesting, at once it's like pushing away like the modern world and like science coming in and melting the face off, but then at the same time it is through something of this world, or something like kind of science based, or at least rational like thinking that solves the problem.
Well, I was thinking about about what solves the problem, both in the Hell House and The Haunting, and I don't remember how the movie The Haunting ends, but the book, it ends with what's her name, Eleanor. Just spoiler alert for the 60-year-old book. She ends up dying, basically. She tries to escape, but I don't know if she's been trying to escape. But there's this idea that she's sort of joined so, she's connected so much with this house and its consciousness that she no longer has. And it seems like in Hell House, at the end, what is his name? Roddy
McDowall?
Yes, Roddy McDowall. I love him. So he seems to finally open up and let himself use his powers, and sort of figures out things based on that. So there's sort of this willingness of an individual to open, which is very dangerous. And there seems to be in each movie a person who can communicate better, and who is either really harmed by that or able to harness that in a way.
Someone that's in tune with this kind of world of the unseen, kind of that. But then in the end, I guess we are moving into Hell House now. I don't know.
Let's go ahead.
Yeah, I don't know if we need a description, but I mean,
maybe.
It's just, I mean, it's pretty much, like The Haunting. There's a house that has a, long history of these different supernatural phenomenon and hauntings, and in Hell House, there's been many expeditions into this house, or like teams of scientists that have gone and tried to figure out the secret to Hell House and kind of quantify its, quote unquote, like evil powers. And so the film Legend of Hell House starts with another team going there at the request of an old man who wants proof that there's life after death. And they go, and once again, they encounter a lot of problems, and there's haunting, there's possession. It's interesting though because the group that's investigating the house consists of a scientist and then psychic mediums, you know. So it's like kind of a cross section of different people that could approach the house, and you know, it's haunted phenomenon in different ways, and they each kind of have their encounter with the house. And I don't want to give anything away at the end, but I guess I do want to talk about the end because we were talking about how these things are resolved, and I think you're right that there is a character that has to open themselves up to this, you know, haunted experience and this force. But I think it's also interesting that Hell House ends essentially, it feels like, with Roddy McDowall psychoanalyzing the problem of the house, you know, employing this kind of I don't know, science, you know, to dispel this curse or whatever. And I thought that was a really interesting. Or maybe it's just truth, you know, maybe in the end he's speaking the truth, and that's what dispels this evil. But I've always liked the end of Hell House.
Or the movie's just deconstructing psychology in general, you know, showing the. I don't know. I feel like this movie and all these movies are so heavy into the psychology. This is one of the reasons why I discovered that I struggle with the ghost story, is that this mostly just doesn't play on fears that I recognize. You know, I think I am a little too rational to, you know, I'm not really worried about ghosts up in my house. You know, that's not that's not really a problem that I experience. But what I really liked about Legend of Hell House is that it kind of dramatizes, you know, it's pure psychology, and from, as you said, the old man who kind of sets them in motion. You know, we can almost taste the desperation in this task that he's setting them, right? Like, before he can die, he needs to know that there's more, and that's you know, that's what kind of drives, I think, stories like this. As well as the plot of the movie, is that this and the climax of the movie is driven by this as well, this absolute fear, this kind of existential fear that this is all there is. And there's something kind of desperate from the beginning to the end of this movie in relation to that, and that everybody kind of has to. And I actually don't know what the answer the movie gives is. That's kind of the question.
I think it does a great job, though, I think it's ultimately a very smart film, and I think it's a haunted house film for me, definitely for adults, you know, where there's ideologies at odds, you know, people with different beliefs forced into this space, different beliefs about the afterlife and energy, and it does really make that this whole issue, is there life after death, and what are we willing to believe, and what do we need to believe? Like, it makes it really explicit, and I like that about it. I think it makes it explicit without being heavy-handed, and I don't know. I felt like maybe that's another thing that draws me to this one more than other haunted house films.
What I liked the most about this movie was the sort of weird camera work, which is, I'm kind of changing topics a bit, so if you want to keep talking about that, please feel free. But it just seemed to often do odd things with the camera. Like, suddenly the camera would be up somebody's nose, basically, right in their face.
Yeah.
Or these weird sort of angles that kind of jarred me a bit, that kind of echoed the house's wrongness somehow. So I thought the filming of it was the most interesting thing to me, I think.
Yeah, I think so. I think that it's the first, it really kind of brings to the forefront of your mind the idea of perspective, like in the haunted house films, like because that camera work is like pretty radical a lot of times, and those angles, you wonder who, you know, what perspective is this from, like this weird fisheye close or wide angle thing.
Who's the viewer? Whose eye is seeing through? What's the perspective? And that's interesting.
And I think, you know, I arrived at maybe in some way it's the house, you know. I mean, sometimes it's explicit, it's very clearly the house, or could be, and I think that that's another strength of the film. That like once you're in the house, you know, its consciousness, it becomes just as much of a character or a possible perspective as anybody else, and sometimes more. And I think that that's kind of, you know, something we were talking about too, that like they are these spaces that have a lot of emotions and memories and psychology in them, and you know, they have their own mind in a way. And I think that's what the camera, I think that's what it's getting at. To
Well, it just makes me think of what Josh was saying about, you know, Josh, you were saying about your problem with the films is often that you're not scared of ghosts. You know, you're not really interested in these questions. And I kind of am the same way. I kind of think, why are you bothering with this when you're about to die? Go do something interesting.
Yeah.
But this idea of space being frightening, of certain spaces having a certain, for the lack of a better word, energy, or some kind of, because there just are spaces you walk into, and for whatever reason, psychological or based on weather patterns, they're ominous, they're frightening, and also there's places where you know things have happened that colors the way you see them, and so I like that. I think that's the one thing you can really latch on to, that we've all had this feeling of walking into a space and feeling, you know, that maybe the wallpaper is watching you because there's something wrong with the space.
Yeah.
I agree, and I think that I was thinking about how there's kind of the two versions of the haunted house. One, which is where it really is the home, the family home, and that seems to have a different kind of dynamic to the, you know, the legendary haunted space like we have in this movie. And I was thinking that a lot of these movies have this kind of archetypal character who's like the bearer of the history, you know, whether that's the person setting the whole thing in motion in Legend of Hell House, or it's the realtor who is always kind of, you know, trying too hard because she knows the history, whatever. There's always that person.
Yeah.
Very seldom do we get the space that just kind of explodes without some sort of buildup. That I think that, Letitia, what you're talking about is that these spaces do have. You were talking about how you know something has happened there. There's something about this kind of shared memory or something that plays into these things.
Yeah. So something I think is interesting about Hell House and The Haunting and the films that kind of follow in this vein is this idea of like moral corruption being this thing that infects the house. I think that's a problematic thing for me. I have a hard time making that jump for some reason because I think it's so kind of at odds with maybe my personal philosophies or something, or my view of humanity, that's my biggest problem probably with the film is accepting that's kind of moral, I guess, like I put it, corruption could turn into something, could have an energy to it, it's not that I don't personally believe that, in a lot of the ideas in this film, but anyway, the idea of morality, did anybody else pick up on that or have any problem with that? Like that's essentially what they're addressing at the end, that this guy was a monster, a moral monster that did enough things that caused, this haunting phenomenon.
That almost seems secondary. It seemed like his immorality was a means to an end, right? That essentially, and I hear us very much talking around the spoilers of this movie.
Yeah.
The person responsible, the owner of the house who's kind of led to it being haunted, essentially kind of, and correct me if I'm wrong, it has been a while since I watched this movie.
Yeah.
It, almost kind of took on the charge of becoming, an Aleister Crowley, most evil man in the world kind of task in order to defeat death, and that's really what this is about, right? That even after death, his energy, his whatever, will live on. That it's less about. I mean, I hear what you're saying. That just it's part of the framework that's set up in the movie to make the plot work. Is this this given that if you're evil enough, you're going to be stuck here.
Yeah.
Which yeah, I would agree with that. But I think that it does allow kind of an interesting, in terms of the psychology of that character, an interesting move there. 'Cause I really do. I see this whole movie and really this whole genre, a lot of ways, just being about this overwhelming fear of death, which of course is central to all horror. But
Yeah.
Well, I did see this idea of the way that the haunting manifested in the characters, especially the women characters, had to do with sort of the moral of sort of sexual morals. So, when they were being corrupted, they were acting in ways that were inappropriate sexually, right? And so I did have that thought about the sort of the thing we talked about in the first episode about if this is sort of a reactionary, conservative genre, essentially, in a lot of ways. Like, it does in the haunted house, even the idea that you can't cheat death, you're not really allowed to do things that are morally wrong. This creates an energy that is evil, that will consume other people. This seems to all be around the fear of crossing some kind of moral or barrier that you shouldn't really be playing with, and that's a very sort of conservative idea. But as always, it also subverts that. But
yeah, I think that's a great tack for us to take, and I think it might actually point us toward Tale of Two Sisters, because what I was going to say is that when you think about those things, the kind of immorality that characters who are caught up in this create, whether that's of sexual nature or violence or whatever, also those things are tied to our homes. I mean, that's what that is what makes up family dramas and traumas, and leads us back to that question of haunting as memory or guilt. That while we may go, Legend of Hell House is just slut shaming, what may really be happening is that we're talking about that that houses do kind of if these walls could talk, right? I mean, the things that go on in any home, good and bad, that there's, I guess, this idea that houses do kind of contain that, the stories that go on there.
Yeah.
And
or at least, at least the history of a family and these idea of history and memory are such a problematic things for us with our finite minds. I think that the idea of a place where those things live is attractive, but at the same time very scary, because it's a total kind of construct. This haunted house idea, that we're like, yeah, this is where the history of the family is, or these memories, or I think I'm going to digress kind of and go back to something that with what Letitia was referencing, that the first episode, I think, Josh, you said something about this excess of life, and in this, the moral idea was leading me to think about something of that creating some kind of excess, something too much that lives on, and for some reason that's not right, and that posits the house with a certain energy. I don't know if that can be, if we could use that also to shift somewhere into Tale of Two Sisters. I mean, because I think that it relates to that somehow as well.
Yeah, I think we probably should transition, but I think this is why I think haunting stories become so problematic, is because the idea of a haunting and the idea of ghosts really just kind of makes it necessary to imagine a whole kind of cosmography. That there's that almost a theology is involved, whether that's a very staid Christian kind of, you sinned so you are trapped here, or whatever, that quite often isn't really explained, or that I'm just, like I said before, I'm like, whatever, like it's not my camp. I'm not in there. I don't really get that drama, and it may be more effective for others, but
I agree. I think that's what keeps me less invested, because I think what you said about a cosmology, or like this kind of like, you have to agree to a universe that operates in a particular way a morally charged universe that I don't necessarily, that it's not speaking to me really. You know what is interesting though? A movie that has an interesting ending though, Beetlejuice, because in the end, if you take it as the excess of life and that they, something bad happens and you linger on as this unnatural thing. No, at the end they're happy. They still live in their house. They're having a good time. I think that's a very kind of subversive haunted house.
Oh, I love that. I love Beetlejuice. That's exactly the reason why I love that movie. It's not that death is frightening. It's like this embrace of all these other possibilities, right?
Yeah, they just live. They just are living on a different plane. It's just a different kind of life, I think that's very interesting about it. It kind of, even though I don't necessarily, agree with that in a certain sense, it undercuts that death dread, in a fun way that I think is important.
Also, a problem for me, before we move on, is that I always think, what are these ghosts doing when they're not haunting somebody? It just seems so boring. Like, what the hell do they do all the time? Do they just wander around waiting to do something? That's always been my problem.
Internet, ghosts have screen names.
I'm pretty sure that Walt Disney cartoons taught me that they wear bowler hats and smoke cigars.
And they do.
They play cards.
Yeah.
That seems reasonable.
Yeah.
All right. So do you guys want to move on to Tale of Two Sisters?
Let's.
So this could be argued. I don't know. Maybe I shouldn't say what I was about to say about it. Yeah, I'll skip that. I was going to give something away.
Oh, say it.
Yeah.
I was going to say, maybe you could argue this is not a haunted house story at all.
I would go so far as to say so, yes.
I would agree with that.
Yeah, it's not much of a leap, but I'll give a little summary, maybe. So this is a Korean film. I can't remember the director's name. Came out, 2001, 2002. It's basically about a girl who seems to be arriving back home from a hospital, maybe a mental hospital, and she seems to be returning to her home where her father and his new wife or girlfriend and her sister are. And as she returns home, there seem to be these disturbances in the house. And we find out also that her mother has died in the house. And so this seems to be related. And that's basically the setup. And there's lots of interactions between the girl and the stepmother figure. And I think that's all I'll say about the plot, because that's kind of the starting point. Yeah, so what did you guys find significant or interesting about this one? Or otherwise?
I will say that for some reason I wasn't a big fan of this film, but I like some of the ideas that it brings forth because, we're going to say it's not a haunted house film. It's definitely the film I think that's most concerned with the psychology of a character represented through this this genre, this idea of a house. And I thought that was really interesting because I think it reflects back the idea that, the whole haunted house as a metaphor for our own minds, and I think that that's very interesting about it. But I don't know. I'm trying to think what my problems were with it. There was something about it that kept me at a bit of a distance. Maybe I was just confused. I don't know.
It's a little confusing, yeah.
Yeah.
It's funny because what I love about it is, of course, this is a Korean film, and it has all those kind of J-horror touches that I was referencing earlier. Where we'd see these glances of the ghost, which actually, for the most part, I thought were pretty effective. They were.
Yeah, I thought so too.
The little girl underneath the sink, kind of peering out. It's worked pretty darn well. And without spoiling too much, that was all misdirection. In the end, that's even that kind of immediate connection with this spirit is really a lie. And so maybe, Chris, what you were feeling, and I think I feel a little bit of this too, although I did like this movie quite a lot, is that in the end we swing too far the other way. It becomes a little too rational, and that we have the other. It's one step away from, and then she woke up. She's crazy, like,
Yeah.
which is also not a satisfying explanation for 2 hours worth of.
Yeah, it kind of left. Yeah, I think in the end it left me in a kind of this relativistic void of just like a lack of kind of significance in a specific sense about the events of the film. You know what I mean? That doesn't mean that the film didn't have something important to tell me, but I did, definitely feel like that I wanted a consequence of sorts. You know what I mean? I mean, there's definitely ties between this and Caligari. You know what I mean? Which I really enjoy. Fool me once, shame on shame on you. But I don't know where I'm going with this. Anyway, yes.
Yeah, I love this movie, but I'd forgotten kind of that the movie explains itself at the end. I had so loved the first before the last 15 minutes that I forgot that you get a rational explanation. And so I had this idea that this movie did not explain anything. And I think that the horror movie itself, as we said, is it's already a metaphor. It's almost not a metaphor. It's just so clearly about the family dynamics and the guilt and the shame that I just didn't want. I wanted them to lop off that last part because I don't need to know that she's crazy and that things are, and we kind of are spoiling the ending. It doesn't, that's fine. But I just didn't know what the point was because it was so much more interesting when you had this dynamic between the father and the stepmother and I love one thing I love about Asian horror films, and they've been overdone and remade, and all this is very familiar. But that at least some of them manage to leave these terrifying yet completely inexplicable moments, and don't bother to tell you what that's about. And I love that when it's done effectively. And this seemed to do that, but then I remembered that pretty much everything was explained, so it didn't do that anymore. So I just pretend the movie ends at 15 minutes before it does, and
there you go. And then you just have a nice meal, and that's good.
Right. I think it's like the American Ghost Story. We need something at the end that somebody can punch,
Oh man.
In these stories, we need something that can that can be explained. I agree. I agree with you.
Explained and then punched.
Right. But I mean, I agree with you 100%. And I think that the first two acts of this 3-act movie are really strong. And I was perfectly happy to be confused and feel like I was being led down this kind of labyrinth. And the movie is gorgeous. And I think that this again just solidifies my belief that that this really is the most cinematic genre. From the very opening scenes, the little girls get out of the car and they go and sit on the little dock by the water.
On the overhead shot.
Right, and the overhead shot that lasts for a really extended period of time. It's just that it really kind of brought attention to itself in my mind. Just how 3 minutes of two girls sitting by a dock and you just wait for something to happen. It was just brilliant. Just the most minimal kind of filmmaking that just puts you on edge from the beginning, and that's what I'm signed up for right there.
I think it's really true about it being the most cinematic, and maybe that's why it is such an experience. These films, more than any of the other ones, that any of the other episodes or types that we've talked about, are the most experiential, most cinematic. Like, I'm just ready to go with it, and no, I did enjoy A Tale of Two Sisters. It was more the end. I was confused, but I felt like a little kind of cheated, I think, at the end. But I agree with you, Josh. Definitely, it's beautiful, and it definitely does, I think, what these haunted house films can do best, and use this whole kind of foggy psychological metaphor to do really cool things, and take, show you things in a way that would be seemingly out of place in, a slasher movie, for instance. They shouldn't be, but someone would balk at that much more quickly than in something like this.
I also felt like the movie was just very, very sure of itself. All of this just makes me hate the last 15 minutes more. But there's the scene where some neighbors, some friends come over for dinner.
Right? What the hell?
Which is just, and it's this incredibly uncomfortable scene, and then it's this very dramatic scene, and then I think we're treated to them in the car on the way home even. Some characters who we will never see again, that.
Yeah.
But, as you're watching, I was never questioning, I just felt like we were in good hands, and it was a pretty traumatic scene, and it fit in there, and I don't know, I really wish that we could kind of edit and just kind of, I don't know, put it on an eternal loop so we can just keep going for the ride rather than getting to the end.
Yeah, I really agree about the earlier statement about particularly like Japanese horror, that it's not, things don't end in total, darkness, but there's at least usually something that is left to kind of gnaw at you and not completely explained. And I think that's like a very effective like scary element for our times, like that gnawing little thing, that unexplainable, unquantifiable thing. Like I like that, and this kind of denied me that, which I didn't like.
Yeah.
Right, and I think it's what Letitia was saying is that that these almost aren't metaphors. It is those things already, and so when we then unpack the metaphor at the end, it's what's the point? Like we're already there. Like
Well, you guys might be heartened to know that The Tale of Two Sisters has been made. Do you guys know this? It was sort of roughly remade into an American film called The Uninvited. So I'm sure that the American version fixes all those problems.
Yeah.
I bet there's something to punch at the end.
Definitely. Probably in the beginning and the middle as well. That I haven't seen it.
The sisters are much older and less clad in the American version.
All right. I'll check it out.
I'm sold.
I have Netflix. I'm ready.
The director, by the way, is Ji-woon Kim. I'm probably saying that wrong, but he did a film called I Saw the Devil, which I really love too.
Okay. I didn't know that he did that.
Yeah.
Just to backtrack a little, Legend of Hell House is John Ho, or Ha, Hough. I never know how to pronounce his name, but he did a really interesting film with John Cassavetes called, I think it's called Incubus, which is maybe worth seeing. But yeah, anyway, just so we are making that, giving people the information.
And unless I'm mistaken, he's also responsible for Disney's little foray into horror in the 80s with Watcher in the Woods.
Yes, he was.
That's right. I'm looking at the IMDb right now. Yes. Is that good?
Which is an interesting take. I think that it would fit exactly into our discussion here of being a really disappointing ending of a pretty spooky movie.
Mm-hmm.
So
I think, though, we should move into Inferno, because I think that might break the cycle that we've been talking about, in my opinion.
Yeah, who wants to summarize Inferno? Someone for it.
I think that's essentially impossible. Yeah. Let me see if I can even remember enough about essentially, I think that Chris is right. Is that we've kind of pointed out the weaknesses of the horror movie, and so Dario Argento, essentially just removes all of those things. He says plot gets in the way, characters get in the way, ghosts get in the way. Let's just focus on the house. And I honestly could not give a plot synopsis. There's it pretty much works in dream logic. I think we have a series of houses, actually, in various places around the world, in Rome and in New York. We have various characters who really exist for brief flashes in order to either descend into some bizarre world or meet up with some camera POV killer or some such thing. It's really just like just a collage of spooky set pieces and really cool lighting. Right?
Yeah, essentially, I think it just put your most beautiful nightmare on repeat for like 4 or 5 times, and that's what I feel like this film is. I mean, it's just exactly what you said, like dispense with character. I mean, I hadn't seen it in a while, and I love Suspiria, but I remembered really liking Inferno, but man, I mean, I just loved this film even more this time. It got to such a pure essence of everything yet we were talking about that we liked about these films, and it just did it so beautifully, and I feel like this film is very, very assured and just totally I don't know, it just exists operating in a world. I mean, this is a totally self-sufficient film, which I also like a lot, that it's a reality unto itself and makes sense within itself and succeeds at that, I think. Thought it was fantastic.
You know, I love Suspiria is one of my favorite movies ever of any type. This movie, though, I had so much trouble with it, and I couldn't figure out why, because it is beautiful, like you're saying, and I love the ridiculous, totally tossed off script, and the actors are terrible, but it doesn't matter, and nothing that anyone's really doing matters. But I love that. But something about the it was so diffuse. I was like, where am I now? What's happening? And I guess I wasn't giving myself over to just to complete the experience of it. I was trying to hang on to some kind of thread of why it was important that this person was walking into this room. I was trying really hard to make connect, and then halfway through I thought, why am I doing this? This is not the kind of movie that this is. But I had a lot of trouble, so I was hoping you guys had a lot to say about it, because I was a little lost.
I think that, I mean, the interesting thing, because when I was watching it again, I remembered some degree like that, there was somebody that it was someone's brother and he had to go find her. But then when I watched it again, I realized, wow, you're shown one person's journey through this haunted space, then another, and the idea of like a kind of protagonist that you are relating to is like kind of shattered at that point. So you're just left kind of with yourself. And then I think at least for me, like by like the 3rd or 4th like journey through the haunted space, I was more in tune with like, okay, it's me. Like I'm going through this. Like I'm going through this experience. And then the last trip through the house, you're given the frightening climax, at the last room in the haunted house ride. Essentially, you're on like a haunted house ride. The last room, you're scared, and it's one last scare. And I don't know. I found this film. I think this film is interesting because it's such a beautiful, artfully made film, but at the same time, it's such a ride that you're invited to take.
Well, I think I agree with that. And whether this movie actually accomplishes all the things that you are saying about it is probably just up for dispute. But what you're describing seems to me to be like the closest thing to reading that I can imagine in a film. That idea of that. When I read a book, that to me that is the definition of being a reader is that you undergo the story, that you kind of what Grant Morrison calls put on your fiction suit, and you climb inside the story, and that's I think what this movie invites you to do was what you described is that he's breaking down the walls of I'm audience and there is the character, because there aren't any characters, and if anything, this movie is meant to be experienced and dreamed. But I mean, I agree with Letitia completely. I mean, everything bad that you could say about this movie, you could say, and one of the things that from the first movie that we started talking about, I was setting up this antagonism between kind of rationality and this idea of a spirit world and hauntings and all that. And I actually thought that Legend of Hell House was kind of antagonistic in that way. Like that if it had a claim it was trying to make, it was kind of ribbing the audience, going, do you buy this? Is this something you want to do? And Inferno basically just says, if you're going to hold on to any of that, boy, this is going to be a miserable time for you. You just have to go with it. So, Letitia, you're waiting for us to say something really smart about Inferno. And
not necessarily, but well, I just was disappointed in myself, and that I didn't enjoy it as much as I thought I would. I only have viewer response for Inferno, that I was mad at myself for not taking this ride. I just felt like, so I guess maybe I'm just too much of a sort of clunky metaphor lover, that I thought, I'm taking this ride. I kind of got that that's where it was going, right? And then I thought, but why? What's the point? I'm not really getting anywhere. I'm just kind of, it started to feel a little repetitive, but it is. It's beautiful. And I mean, this isn't actually, I'm not criticizing the movie, because I think that it's exactly what it is, and it's lovely. And, no one makes someone being stabbed or whatever as beautiful as Argento does. And I love that. I love that. But I started to feel like I'm kind of in the hands of someone who's not really, I didn't know where I was going, and I felt like I wasn't getting anything from it. And I think that's because I'm just kind of a clunky sort of, I want to always be learning something. And that's my problem. And I didn't know what I was supposed to be getting out of the experience, besides sort of like being on a roller coaster.
I think it is a bit, I do love the film, but I don't think it's faultless. I think definitely, it's a little redundant, and I think that it has sequences that work better than others. I think I'm just I was so exhilarated by how far the film decided to go, after the success of Suspiria, to really strip that experience down to its most, essential kind of elements, and go see how far, it could go. And it says something about the results, because Inferno is not regarded anywhere near, I think, in the same realm as Suspiria. But I think this, just taking that chance, and I'm so glad a film like this exists, like a very pure like experience like that. It's an attempt, I think, at a pretty pure horror experience. I really thought was cool.
I think one of the things that I appreciated about it, which moves a little way from the haunted house movie, and I think that we might be able to say the same thing that Letitia said about Tale of Two Sisters, this isn't really a haunted house movie, is that, of all of the films that attempt to capture that kind of dream quality, the nightmare world, this movie, I think, is probably the most successful in that, that way of, you're moving through a doorway. And sorry, my phone is ringing.
It's Dario Argento, and he's not happy with the way you're talking about his film.
But just capturing that dream feeling that, I move through a door and all of a sudden somewhere else. There's a grate in the alleyway. I go through it. I'm swimming in a ballroom.
That's beautiful. Yeah.
That I'm a character who, here's the star of the show right now, and 3 minutes later, that whole person has just kind of vanished, and there's a new person who's, I couldn't tell the difference between a single damn character in this movie. One woman was basically, there was going to be another Italian woman to take her place in just a second, and but kind of the same but a little bit different. I think about all the heavy-handed movies that attempt to do that, with the added benefit that nobody wakes up at the end. That it was just that this really is the experience.
I just think, like, it's amazing to see, someone in the realm of horror, I don't think you see a film like this come out that aligns itself so heavily with, with being so surreal and kind of avant-garde in a lot of ways. Like, that's just something that horror movies aren't supposed to do, in a certain sense. People are not as open to that. And I was just loving it, seeing this film where there was so much uncertainty, not just on a story level, but just on a perspective level, and how is this film functioning, and it just was like, it's out there, and I really love that about it. And someone, when we talk about going through this nightmare and going into this world, I think also Tobe Hooper does this very well. And I think Poltergeist, even though it is such a strong story, and there are sequences of just nightmare logic that you can give yourself over to that are also so strong. I feel like Argento and Tobe Hooper might be my two beacons that really know what that world is really about. Even something like, from Texas Chainsaw Massacre to Funhouse, those movies are descents into a nightmare, which I guess I'm equating with a haunted house.
Yeah, it seems like we've strayed a bit from the haunting theme. Our movies took us there, but
yeah.
Well, you guys have convinced me that I need to watch Inferno again with less expectations. Maybe.
Well, Letitia, it's just part of a trilogy, right? This
God.
This mother thing, and if you watch the rest of them, it'll all make sense.
What's the third one? See, I've only seen Suspiria and this one. And no, I've seen another Argento movie. What's the third?
Mother of Tears.
Mother of Tears, yeah.
Yeah.
Is it good?
I haven't seen it, but I haven't heard good things.
Yeah.
But I think it's interesting you said that we have kind of strayed away from the haunting thing, but I think, the films definitely led us there. You know what I mean? And I think it would be interesting for us to do an episode that focused on possession.
Yeah, I thought of that too.
Because maybe possession is closer to what we're talking about and would give us, a rich kind of discussion, because maybe it says something about the nature of these haunted house films. It definitely led us away from haunting. Haunting, there wasn't much, I feel, for us to, I don't know. I'd be interested to talk about possession.
Yeah, I think that the possession, which comes into these stories so much, at least seems to, have a little more metaphorical heft to it. While I'm also not really concerned about demons taking over my body, in the same way I'm not worried about ghosts taking over my house, there does seem to be something a little more genuinely horrific about that as a concept, in its kind of analogs with illness, body horror, all those kinds of things that, I don't know, a personification of evil, whatever. There's something that's a little more rich there than our ghost story, I think.
Yeah, I think that it's more contemporary fear. Like, we definitely talked about body horror at a certain point, and where that seems, at a certain point, that's the horror of our time, and things that this kind of maybe this ghost, this just thing that's there. I don't know. Maybe we need something corporeal, to these days and then if it's possessing us, that's giving us that body contact that, we're craving. I don't know.
Well, have any of you seen recent haunted house films? What? There's Are You Afraid of the Dark? That was a remake, right?
I saw The Haunting in Connecticut, but that was essentially a possession
film, right?
I think the lines are blurred heavily now. I feel like a lot of haunted house stuff I see involves some element of possession. Doesn't Paranormal Activity have some kind of possession?
Yeah, that's possession is the central issue. It's really possession and not haunted house.
I was just going to say, I think that's now become a major element there, because I think that this this fear of the space itself, or this fear of the ephemeral thing in the space, is not really affecting us as much anymore, and it has to be transferred to our body and a physical experience, you know.
Maybe it's because of something about like families not really being, like often the old hauntings is like sort of a family, like the Amityville Horror and Poltergeist. I guess they're not that old, but that the family home is not so much the central concern anymore. Maybe? I don't know.
I think there's definitely less concern with like the legacy of the family and
Yeah.
the family name and these ideas. That's not something I feel like in our culture is really as something that we talk about or think about as much. And then the family home, I don't think it is the same thing anymore at all. I mean, I think now, for the best, we have this idea that a family is something that is mobile and you take with you and is not tied to a place, and isn't even tied by blood or by, you know what I mean? Like, I like the more kind of contemporary idea of what a family is. And I think that that's definitely at odds with this haunting idea.
So our capacity for guilt has grown a great deal when we're not tied down by blood ties anymore.
Yeah.
I like where you're going with that, and I was thinking that, I think if I were to write what I would consider a satisfying ghost story, heaven forbid, that I would see it as really a family drama in the way that Tale of Two Sisters kind of is, as Poltergeist most certainly is, and that basically the reason that we need a ghost in the story at all is a catalyst to, get these characters moving and talking and acting.
Yeah.
That basically a good ghost story should look like Ibsen, and that some contemporary movies that I think might be better ghost stories than some of these ghost stories are things like Funny Games.
Oh, Jesus.
Yeah.
Or
Interiors, something like that. Yeah, I hear what you're saying.
Where it's more about, here we are in this enclosed space, here we are with all of the memory, the guilt, the shared history, and now we've got this catalyst that's going to make us, deal in some way.
Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf? Maybe a terrifying ghost story. I think oh man, definitely. I've seen the monster in that haunted house, and it's pretty damn scary. But yeah, I think that's true.
I had a quick thing. I was thinking, because I didn't grow up in houses, I grew up in trailers, and I thought, you can't really make a haunted trailer because it's so impermanent, and so much of the way we live is it's not quite so permanent. We don't have these huge permanent structures anymore. I mean, people have houses, but so I'm going to write a haunted trailer movie, I think.
I think I would definitely watch that. But I agree. I think it's definitely tied to, this kind of, families aren't, I don't know. I'm not from a family that laid roots for generations and generations in one place, We moved, and we ran away from the ghosts,
Our houses don't even last for generations anymore.
Right?
Yeah.
We're everything's so impermanent now. We don't even have space for our ghosts anymore.
They're just wandering around in the lot where our house used to be.
That's why there needs to be more internet-based ghost movies,
right?
I think.
There's Japanese films about this. Right? Like, what is it? There's one specifically about ghosts in technology, right?
Ghost in the Shell? Ghost in the Shell?
No.
I don't know. I know there's Ghost in the Machine. There's Fear.com. There's a couple of them. Lawnmower Man. I think that's like a haunting of like the internet, kind of, or computers. Anyway, we're digressing big time.
Yeah. Any last thoughts before we wrap up here?
No, I guess pretty much my thought is I'm only going to rent. I don't want to own a home. That's it.
No manners for me.
Yeah.
Trailers.
No, I don't have anything pithy to add. I don't know.
That's all right.
All right. Well, we can go ahead and kind of wrap it up. So I think we all had a thought that the horror film, or not the horror film, but the ghost story, but the haunting, is maybe going somewhere different. So that's interesting. And we were all a little bit disappointed by the last part of the haunted house movie. I think that's interesting. I did not think that would happen.
Yeah, we're too rootless and jaded, but you know
Right?
what? There's still hope.
If you think about it, from what we've been saying all along, that the haunted house movie is kind of like it is almost a metaphor for cinema. That's the way it should be, right?
Mm-hmm.
That we should be disappointed when it ends, right?
Oh yeah, nice.
That's beautiful. That was the pithy thing to end on right there. So with that, thank you guys so much.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.